I believe that frontline journalism is important. Without these photos and videos and firsthand experience, we can't really tell the world how bad it might be.
There does seem to be a strong sense that they won't give up the fight, and that there are a force of young fighting men. Although unorganized, there's plenty of will to hold out here.
If Gaddafi comes to Benghazi, are you guys prepared to fight?
No, but we have a strong faith. We won't give up.
Jim chose the stories that weren't being really shown in the mainstream media. He went a lot deeper than just showing bang bang, what we call like frontline images of people firing off guns.
Jim would just listen. This taught me a lot as well about going into situations without preconceived ideas about it. He would go into a situation obviously with a general idea, and then it would be malleable based on what would happen.
But today a lot of children.
Everyday children.
Which allowed things to go into certain directions that it usually wouldn't, and you end up finding more.
Who are the Libyan rebels determined to overthrow 42 years of dictatorship?
I work in accounting. I have a small company.
I am welder, working in offshore
Welder.
platform. Yeah.
Okay. Dangerous job.
He chose one story in particular about a Libyan fighter, actually, who went to Syria. And Jim spent quite a lot of time with him. His name was Firas. And he got very deep and very intimate into the story. And I think that's what I respect most about Jim, was that he wanted to show a different side of this stereotype. He took a different strand from that.
He was really trying to teach me, John, you need to look outside of yourself. John, it's not about physical or monetary things. It's about how you act. It's who you teach, who you mentor. Who's gonna remember you? What are they gonna remember about you?
You know, the thing is there's physical courage, right? For some reason, I have physical courage. But really, think about it, that's nothing compared to moral courage. I can go and get those shots, but if I don't have the moral courage to challenge authority, to write about things that are gonna maybe have reprisals on my career, if I don't have that moral courage, we don't have journalism.
I think that's finished. Good afternoon. I'm Belinda Goldsmith. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where I lead a fantastic global team of 55 journalists covering the billions of people around the world who are locked out of traditional economies and whose rights are constantly and escalating seeing threats. I'm here this afternoon with Diane Foley, the mother of James Foley, the journalist who was abducted by ISIS and killed in 2014. And I'm with Colin Pereira, who is the chief strategist for journalist safety at the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, the CPJ, and also a director of security consultancy, HP Risk Management. Diane, James was a teacher. He went into journalism. Then he ended up in Libya in 2011. And this was the first time he was abducted, and this time he was taken hostage for 44 days. Right. Did you realise at the time the risks that he was starting to have in his jobs?
Well, to be honest, I was incredibly ignorant of the risks that journalists take, that truly anybody takes who works internationally, particularly in conflict zones or areas of great poverty. So I was very ignorant, really, of the risks.
How did you find out on that occasion that he had been abducted?
On that occasion, we were contacted by Consular Affairs in our State Department.
And did they give you any support? Did they give you any advice?
They called often. They made us feel that they were on the case, but it was interesting that the person who actually figured out how to get Jim out was a private citizen who also had a freelancer who was abducted with Jim.
And how did he get James out?
Well, his name is David Bradley. He owns Atlantic Media in Washington, D.C., and his background is research. So he found out that one of Gaddafi's sons had a young woman from Vermont who had worked with him. And so he somehow found this young woman who was now stateside in Vermont, and she flew to Libya and convinced Gaddafi's son to release him.
And was the government involved at all in that stage, in that trip that she took over there?
In one sense, in that we did not have diplomatic relations with Libya, but they were in touch with the other ambassador who was able to receive him and get him out of the country. Right. So in that sense, they certainly assisted.
So James came home. He then started working a bit for Human Rights Watch and went back to Libya. And then, of course, in 2012, he went to Syria.
Right. Exactly.
As his mother, did you say, don't go, stay at home? Did you try and dissuade him?
We all did, family and friends. But it became very obvious, as with so many of you, that he was passionate about what he was doing. You know, when I hear Jim talk about aspiring to moral courage, all of you remind me of him. All of you continue his legacy, because it's that moral courage to keep doing whatever you feel called to do in spite of the risk that makes the difference. And it was obvious that Jim felt he had found his vocation.
Did he talk to you about extra security precautions that time, or what he was doing to try and stay safe?
He really tried to limit any discussion about that because he didn't want to worry us about it, but he had in fact taken all that was available in terms of hostile environment and first aid training, risk training. So he had done all that he felt he knew to do as a freelancer to be safe.
You spoke to him just a few weeks before he was abducted. Yeah. Did he tell you that he was worried about the situation, or had he noticed any change in the situation on the ground at all?
Jim never talked about that. He called to give me condolences on the death of my aunt, who had turned 100, died at the age of 103. So that was the reason for his call.
And he was abducted, of course, along with British journalist John Cantil in November 2012. How were you informed that time? How did you find out he had been taken hostage?
Well, it was interesting because on Thanksgiving Day, which is a big holiday in the United States, it was odd because we did not hear from him. And so we were concerned about that because Jim was very good about calling. And the next morning, one of his colleagues, actually who was in the film, Nicole Tung, called to tell us that Jim and John had been kidnapped.
And did you get more support that time? Did the government move quicker? Did organizations come in to support and help you?
No. It was a really frightening time because FBI was in charge of it this time because Jim vanished. We had no idea where he was for the next 9 months. And, FBI didn't seem to know. About 3 weeks after his abduction, an agent was sent to us and into Syria. But by then, the rumors were rampant, and he had disappeared.
When was the first time you heard of any sightings of him?
The first time was about 9 months after his abduction. In September and October of 2013, we received messages from strangers that his name had been heard in prisons in northern Syria. So that was good news for us.
And then, of course, you got an email. His brother, one of his 4 brothers, got an email, I believe, about a year after his abduction. Right. What did they want in that email, and how did you know it was genuine?
Well, we didn't at first at all, but what they wanted was for us to give them proof of life questions so that they could prove, first of all, they had Jim. And then secondly, after they proved that they had him, that's when they asked for €100 million or the release of all Muslim prisoners.
And did the FBI get involved at that stage?
They were not able to directly be involved. We shared emails with them, and they counseled us. But the hands of our government was truly tied.
Were there any journalist organizations at that point that could help you?
We were approached by, RSF approached us, and eventually we approached the Committee to Protect Journalists, asking for help, but they didn't really know how to help. And I didn't know what to ask of them, truly, either. I was so clueless, really, we trusted our government to take care of it for too long, actually. And I think we really should have looked to more people with expertise like you, Colin, had we realized.
Well, you came from a nursing background. None of your family had been journalists. How did you go about even researching what to do or who to go to for help?
Just kept asking and I quit my job and started going to Washington as often as I could and met with anyone who would talk to me and connected with any journalists who would talk to me. Phil Balboni of Global Post in Boston and David Bradley of The Atlantic and David Rode, who at that time was with Reuters, were a tremendous support. All three of them were with us through that journey. But otherwise, we had no idea what we were doing.
Do you think it would have been different if James hadn't been American?
Absolutely. And I think that's the tragic part, that Jim was kidnapped and held with 17 other Westerners, all allies of ours, all different countries, and had the community come together, I think, first of all, we would have understood the brutality of ISIS, but also maybe there would have been some hope of getting all of them home. But instead, each country negotiated on their own. Actually, Joel Simon of the Committee to Protect Journalists has written an interesting book called We Want to Negotiate, because one of the problems with our government is our government felt they could not engage with the captors at all. So Jim's fate was, at that point, decided, because they did not engage at all with captors. So therefore, there was no hope to really bring him home from the government side.
Colin, this was a different situation. You'd worked for the BBC, I think, for 9 years, then ITN for 5 years. You'd gone very much into risk management by this stage as well. So you'd been that year, you'd been to Turkey, I think, and you'd seen things changing on the ground. What were the changes you were seeing in 2012?
Yeah, so we'd been covering the Arab Spring, and to begin with, you've got to understand the context of the Arab Spring. It was the regimes versus the people, and the people really helped journalists cover these stories. So with Syria, we felt it would be the same thing, and certainly in the early years that was the case. What happened in 2012 is the people were getting fed up of journalists coming to refugee camps and saying, if we tell your story, the world will sit up and start paying attention. And people in the northeast of Syria were becoming inured to the fact that that was not the case. And so when I was put on the border for ITN in the summer of 2012, we were sending an individual, a German filmmaker, across into Aleppo, and he had great contacts in Syria, and he was very smart. And actually what he had done is he had raised a lot of money, and he had actually had a truck full of aid come from Germany, and he was going to distribute this aid in Aleppo, and then on the back of that he was going to start making a film for us. So we thought this is a perfect avenue. The people will really engage with him and like him. And he had two fixers. One of the fixers was subsequently kidnapped and killed himself by ISIS. But the second fixer, when they were on the ground in Aleppo, I got phone calls on the last day when he was supposed to leave, and he was saying, I'm very worried about this second fixer. Things are not, he's not telling me the truth. And when we did get Marcel out, he said to me, look, I actually think I came that close to being kidnapped. So on that trip, I had noticed, when I'd flown in, I noticed there were jihadis on the plane with me. In fact, the Turks had questioned me a lot because of my sort of makeup. I think they thought I was, potentially a jihadi crossing the border. I had seen a lot of jihadi activity on the border with Syria. And I went back to the boss at ITN and I said, I'm concerned there's something going on here. There are a lot of whispers that the ground is changing, the strategic ground is changing, and I just don't think we should be sending people in. And that then created a vacuum for a lot of freelancers to go in because every news organization was having a similar conversation.
So the bigger media organizations were starting to react to the fact that the situation was deteriorating, but the freelancers were going with no protection, no help?
Well, it's a market economy, right? So if news organizations are not sending their journalists to these locations, then the freelancers will go in and fill that gap because people still want to see the content, they still want to buy the content. And in fact, this is exactly what's happening in Rojava right now. With all the strategic changes in Rojava, a number of big news organizations have pulled out. They're going back in slowly, but in that gap, freelancers have gone in.
Of course, and very tragically in 2014, James was killed by ISIS. And it was by Jihadi John, who was one, as you mentioned, Colin, one of the foreign fighters who was going in there. Jihadi John being a British guy who'd gone in and was a part of the group called the Beatles, died in a drone attack in 2015. Exactly. Did you receive much support when that happened?
Support from, we've received support from all over the world. Literally. The world community was incredibly supportive. So in that sense, we've received a lot of support. I think the hardest part has been getting any justice. There's a huge, when you think of all the human rights atrocities of Syria, so much, and there's so much impunity in terms of what's happened. But the same with Jim. There are 2 of the 4 British jihadists were captured in January of 2018. And were actually held in that part of northern Syria until very recently. But they still have not been brought to justice. They have not been brought to trial.
I know you've campaigned in DC for that, for them to go to the US to be tried. What sort of response have you received to that?
Our Department of Justice wants to prosecute them, but there have been a lot of barriers. One of the El-Sheikh's mother has filed suit to protect her son, and so that he might be tried in the United Kingdom, and that is now before the Supreme Court. So that's held it up in a great way.
Did you feel any sense of justice at all last month when the US did find the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and he died?
Well, I was glad that he was found and stopped, because that means that prevented other people from being hurt by him and his leadership. However, I fear that ISIS, some of the fighters have escaped, and that others had escaped previously. So I fear that it is still an entity, that type of hatred is something that is still a threat.
In 2014, you set up the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation. What are you hoping to achieve with that, and what are you working towards?
Well, 2 things primarily. We during Jim's captivity and even after his death, his life was not worth much in our country. He was not a priority, and I feel our citizens should be. So we advocate for the return of our citizens, that it might be a high priority for our government. And also we fully support all efforts at journalist safety. And the bit we are doing involves schools of journalism, particularly in the United States, really encouraging faculty to have students really skilled at risk assessment and digital security primarily, so that they can go into whatever type of journalism they might want to in a way that they can protect themselves, their sources, and the people they interview in the best way.
Colin, the CPJ has set up an emergency team, and also it's tried to ramp up the Journalists in Distress network. What are those initiatives working on?
Sure. So I think after Diane and Jim's experience, the CPJ was primarily an advocacy organization, and it wanted to be more helpful to people in Diane's situation. So what it did is set up this team called the Emergencies Team, which is there to provide practical and realistic support to individuals who are in trouble in some way. And also, we do a lot of preventative advice. So, for example, the advice that I gave to the CEO of ITN before, ITN had people kidnapped, we would now share that advice with freelancers, saying, is this really sensible to be going across at this point in time? So that is a really practical mechanism to help people, but I would say, we're a small team. There are thousands of journalists who approach us annually. There's a lot of capacity issues there. And with the Journalism in Distress Network, what I would say is not just the CPJ ramping it up. There are a number of organizations like RSF, FPU, a lot of freedom of expression organizations involved in the Journalism in Distress Network. And what that is primarily an assistance program which can provide financial assistance to individuals who are in trouble. That does not mean they will pay ransoms. That's a different thing. But if you are a journalist who needs to be relocated, if you have some sort of security requirement, say like a camera installed on your front door to deter surveillance, those are the kind of things that Journalism in Distress Network can assist with.
Okay. At Trust Conference today, obviously we've been talking about freedom of the press and the rising levels of violence against members of the media as well. And figures from Reporters with Borders show that I think 80 journalists were killed last year, and 60 were held hostage, mainly in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, which was 11% up on the year before, 6 of which were foreign journalists. Obviously, the people are making these abductions and killing journalists. Would love journalists not to go to these areas and cover it. Should these sorts of levels of violence stop journalists from going there?
Well, then we wouldn't know, would we, Belinda? That's the problem. I think there are many people involved in hostage-taking and a targeting of journalists with many different goals in mind. Some are financial, some are political. In many cases, they don't want the people of their country to know what's really happening. So there's many reasons that this happens, but these are truly human rights issues. The taking of innocent citizens, be they aid workers or educators or journalists, and certainly the deliberate targeting of journalists makes them want to frighten them into submission, so that the world we'd have huge black holes of places in our world where nobody knows what's truly happening. So, we need heroic journalists. Without them, how are we going to be free? So, I commend the many of you who go out in the world doing things that can be dangerous. That is the risk. That's reality. And that's why I think it's so vital that people be aware of the risk and know how to intentionally assess risk wherever they live, wherever they work, and do what they can to protect themselves.
Colin, how do you make sure that media organisations take on board the risks that are involved and still do send journalists to those areas?
So media organisations in more recent years have basically really professionalised the security elements to their business. So previously, it used to be just, I'm off to Afghanistan, have you got your camera? Here's a bit of cash, off you go. Now there's a risk assessment process, there's an editorial process which questions the worth of the story versus the risk. There's a lot of training, which Diane was mentioning, for the individual journalists. There's a lot of training for the managers, right? So, which is crucial. Managers need to understand how to manage people in hostile environments and what to do when there is a crisis and how to react quickly. So there is a lot of infrastructure now put in place about managing the risk of when people are sent to hostile environments. And what I would say is that infrastructure now, for more reputable news organizations, that now extends to the freelancers to say, should we be commissioning these people, taking these enormous risks, when we won't send our own people in to do that?
It's an expensive process, isn't it? So what happens with the smaller and medium organisations that can't afford to take those sort of precautions and train their staff and equip them properly?
Well, unfortunately, small and medium organisations can't afford that, so they do come to people like us at the Committee to Protect Journalists. We can offer them some degree of assistance. But the truth is, the training is expensive, but common sense is not, right? And treating journalists the way you would want your son or your daughter treated, not seeing them as disposable items. That, and I actually had an editor once say to me, he said, I don't know why you make such a fuss about safety, Colin. If I lose a journalist, I just get another one, right? That was about 10 years ago. I think that kind of conversation has diminished, but, if that is your attitude, I don't think you should be in the journalism field.
Yes,
and I so agree with that. I also want to mention that in 2015, many media companies, hundreds actually, came together with press freedom groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and freelancers, particularly to help protect the increasing number of freelancers who often don't have access to the expensive hostile environment training or insurance or the salary to be able to stay in a safe hotel or have a safe fixer, things like that, basic things, and editor training of how to handle freelancers, as Colin says. So this alliance has come together to hopefully have more of a culture of safety around it.
We're running out of time. A quick question for both of you. What key thing would you like to see change in the next few years to ensure that journalists, when they are going to these areas, are safe and are protected? Colin, and I'll finish for Diane. Colin?
Well, I think it's about pay. I think local journalists in particular and freelancers should be paid fairly. A lot of the time, we have conversations with people who, when we're talking about security, they say, look, I just have to put food on the table for my kids. I can't start this conversation with my editor. And the little steps they can take, like installing a camera on their front door so that they know if someone's carrying out surveillance on them, that's a minimal expense, which they can't do if their news organization won't pick up the cost, and they certainly can't do it if they're living on minimum wage.
Thank you. Diane?
I really think it's coming together like this. I think a lot of these issues are not just our issues. They're world issues. These are hostage taking is part of human trafficking. This is a human rights issue, as is the targeting of our journalists. So I think it's important that all people understand the issues. I certainly did not. I had no idea how we got our news or the risks journalists take or aid workers or any of you change makers. I had no idea. And I think we need to certainly raise awareness and work together. I think a lot of this was stronger together. And
thank you very much. We're out of time. Thank you very much, Diane Foley, and to Colin Pereira.
Thank you, Belinda. Excellent job. Thank you.